Hello and welcome back. I'm Steve Murphy, a trust and estates attorney with McGuire Woods LLP, and this is Legacy Planning Once Removed, my podcast on estate planning, legacy, property, family, taxes, and everything else on my mind. When I was preparing for this episode, I had to admit I got really excited. I felt like I'd stumbled upon an issue that we've actually been talking about for all these episodes on this podcast. And now I have a specific example of a development of the law that might just help us flesh out how to incorporate that into the planning or the administration of a trust. And it's called a beneficiary well-being trust. There's a statute passed recently in Delaware that provides this kind of trust. Now, Delaware really holds itself out as a premier jurisdiction for trusts, so they always want to see themselves as sort of on the cutting edge of developments in trust law. Maybe it's related to modification of trust or investments. But in this case, it has to do with some interactions with beneficiaries and distributions. Well, this beneficiary well-being trust seems to be a really general term. And I guess what they have in mind here is beneficiary well-being in the real broadest sense. So let's remind ourselves of some traditional goals that someone might try to address in their estate and legacy planning. Maybe it's minimizing taxes. Maybe it's preserving the trust assets for the next generation or future generations. Maybe it's asset protection. And maybe it's making distributions to beneficiaries based on those typical standards of health, education, maintenance, or support. On this podcast, we talk about some other goals we might incorporate into that planning. Maybe it's facilitating good behavior by the beneficiaries or productive behavior, or maybe it's avoiding negative behavior, maybe avoiding that trust fund baby that so many clients are really worried about and they want to avoid. And again, this is what we talk about a lot on this podcast. And like this podcast, the concept of the beneficiary well-being trust takes this one step further and starts to apply these concepts. So the statute walks through an example of maybe how to use the trust itself to facilitate some of these objectives. And in particular, it shows how the trust can be a resource to provide educational and other opportunities for the beneficiary. So again, this concept of beneficiary well-being in this broad sense, it's a topic I love to talk about and I write about and I give presentations on. So in this episode, I'm just really going to focus on this Delaware statute. I'm envisioning that this might be one of several episodes where we explore these concepts in a little more detail. So let me start by pointing out a couple important features of the Delaware statute. This Delaware statute provides that you can actually draft a trust and essentially call it a beneficiary well-being trust. And if you do that, then the trustee has the power and maybe even the obligation to provide what's called beneficiary well-being programs. Okay, what does that mean? I'm going to just quote the statute a little bit. The statute says that these programs means seminars, courses, programs, workshops, counselors, personal coaches, short-term university programs, group or one-on-one meetings, counseling, family meetings, family retreats, family reunions, and custom programs designed to encourage this kind of good productive behavior on the part of the beneficiaries. Again, I love that idea. Then let's think about what would the subject matter of these programs be? There are two examples provided in the statute, and I'm going to give one more. The statute says that the goal of these programs should be, and I'm going to quote, I love this language, preparing each generation of beneficiaries for inheriting wealth by providing the beneficiaries individually or as a group with multi-generational estate and asset planning, assistance with navigating intergenerational asset transfers, developing wealth management and money skills, financial literacy and acumen, business fundamentals, entrepreneurship, knowledge of family businesses, and philanthropy. Oh, that is just terrific. And in fact, these are some of the concepts I talked about in a recent episode. I had a lot of fun on that episode. It's episode 28, called Passing on Values and Life Skills, Lessons from Golf. And in that episode, I didn't just talk about golf. I talked about activities like golf. And I used this metaphor that we often throw around in this industry of the football wide receiver. Remember that metaphor that we often in football draw out these complicated plays with the whole intent being to get the ball in the hands of the receiver. But then sometimes once the receiver catches the ball, sometimes the receiver doesn't really know what to do with the ball. Right? That's that second step. And that's what we're concerned about in some of this legacy planning. Sometimes we're so focused on minimizing taxes and providing asset protection and providing these transfers to get the money to the beneficiary, but we forget to think about how do we educate and empower that beneficiary to take action once the transfer is complete. Well, this beneficiary well-being program seems tailored to do just that. So what it would encourage or maybe even require the trustee to do is to provide those kinds of programs on these specific topics. Another example of a beneficiary well-being program, I'll quote the statute again, educating beneficiaries about the beneficiary's family history, the family values, family governance, family dynamics, family mental health and well-being, and connection among family members. Well, that reminds me of our episodes about the letter of wishes, of how to communicate these wishes and these values to different generations. Now, I'll add one more maybe category of beneficiary well-being programs. I feel like the slant of these categories of programs is really geared towards the transfer of wealth. But I would remind us that one of the things we're really trying to do with a lot of these trusts is empower the beneficiaries to do their own work, empower them, enable them to be actors, to be agents. So I would add one more group to this, which might be just helping the beneficiaries live those productive and healthy lives. Again, maybe removed from the trust, but almost like how can the trust facilitate the beneficiary living out their life in that way? One more thing that the statute does is it provides that the expenses of these kinds of programs should be paid by the trust. So maybe that just allows the trustee to feel a little freer in engaging those kinds of programs. But obviously the settlor or the trust can always provide a different setup for how these expenses are paid. So we've got this great structure now of the beneficiary well-being trust, and it just reminds us of maybe what we should already be doing in our trusts and in our conversations about legacy planning. In these episodes, I like to always leave us with some next steps or questions for the listeners. This is going to be a longer section on what those next steps are, because I think we've got a lot of great options. There are a lot of different people from different industries that listen to this podcast. For trust officers and financial advisors and family offices, you might think about what kinds of programs might you provide to family members or beneficiaries or your clients. For the settlor who's setting this up, they might also similarly think about, are there programs you'd want to set up and encourage the trust to provide? And then for beneficiaries, you might just raise your hand and say, I would love to hear a presentation on X, Y, or Z. So here are some examples of some programs that might fit into this category of beneficiary well-being programs. Well, one of them, I mean, I hate to say it, but this podcast could be a resource for beneficiaries to understand more about how the trust operates and maybe how the trust can be used to facilitate some objectives and goals that they have. You could also prepare a more targeted presentation about how trusts operate. We often give presentations in this area, and we give one talk that's really well received called How to Be a Good Beneficiary and a Good Trustee. It just explores in more detail the relationship between beneficiary and trustee and maybe how the trust operates. And in those cases, often being a good beneficiary is about being an educated beneficiary and an active and empowered beneficiary. The programs could also explore charitable planning. I'm envisioning maybe some programs that help to educate the beneficiaries or family members about how to evaluate charities. What might not just be good causes to support, or what are causes the settlor might have intended, but also how would you evaluate a charity's budget or their operations to make sure that the funds are being used in the appropriate way. You could have presentations on investments, maybe specific subject matters like if a beneficiary wants to invest in real estate or a beneficiary wants to start a small business, what are some questions they should be asking? You could also help the beneficiary understand to look ahead to selling that business. Again, how could the trust provide some resources and educational opportunities to empower the beneficiary to better understand the choices they're going to make? And of course, those discussions could also be related to a family business. On this podcast, we've given an episode on the family cottage. There could be similar presentations about the family cottage, getting everyone together to understand how this cottage would operate, the settlor's wishes, and then again, empowering the beneficiaries to make sure that the cottage lasts and serves its intended purposes. But then I think maybe about just some broader topics that might be of real interest to the family or to beneficiaries. Just a small list could be, how about a presentation on parenting, balancing work and life and parenting? Now, not me. I don't think I should be the person who presents on that. My wife and I have 4 school-age children, but I don't think I'd be an expert that could give any presentation on that. But I would love to hear those kinds of presentations. And how about raising productive children? This is a question we get from our clients a lot. What are some tips to raise productive children, especially if those children are surrounded by wealth? Sort of a unique and ironic challenge of many of our clients. How about a presentation on health, sleep, nutrition, and exercise? How about a presentation about issues of dementia? I mean, that could be a challenging but really helpful discussion among the family members. Or how about presentations on other kinds of life skills? I give a talk on goal setting that a lot of my law students and other audiences have really enjoyed. It's called How to Finish the Impossible Project. And it talks about setting and reaching goals and evaluating goals and uses the example of the Rubik's Cube. Or there could be a talk on productivity. I give a talk on how to have a productive day, something that a lot of my colleagues and students are really interested in. Yes, in that case, I do use the example of golf, but I think you could apply to any number of golf-like activities. Or presentations on communications. I give a talk to my law students called Sweat the Small Stuff, and tips on presentations and polishing. So here are just a handful of examples of these beneficiary well-being programs that the trust might think about facilitating. But let's take a step back and remind ourselves what the real goal of this podcast is. If you've identified specific issues you would like to have carried out in the future, don't wait until after your death. Start now. How about arranging for one of those programs now among the whole family about health or charitable planning or investments or the family cottage or any number of these issues? And while you're talking about those specific issues, that's also a great opportunity to explore family values and how you might approach this. Again, a great way to bring the family together. And hey, while you're at it, you might as well share my podcast. All right, well, that's maybe just my first word on this concept of a beneficiary well-being program and a beneficiary well-being trust. And I'm sure we'll have some more episodes to come. Well, here we are. I'm Steve Murphy, and this has been Legacy Planning Once Removed, my podcast on thoughtful planning and thoughtful living. Thanks for listening.